I want to begin tonight's presentation with a couple of personal stories. These stories may remind you of similar stories in your own history, perhaps even from the history that you lived out today. Someone very wise once told me that a possible way to understand ourselves is to see life as a gigantic narrative where the plot is mostly unknown, but where our personal stories are both the prose and the poetry. And like most prose and poetry, we sometimes create the story very intentionally, and sometimes we just experience its creation. The personal stories that I'm going to share with you are definitely of the second kind. Now, the first story began many years ago in the hospital where my daughter was born. Due to some unfortunate circumstances from a previous pregnancy, my wife was under the care of a medical team specializing in high-risk pregnancy cases. For months, my wife was closely monitored, but thankfully we found ourselves in that hospital room at full term with labor vigorously underway. It was a shared room, and in the next bed was a young woman who was also under the care of the high-risk team because she was pregnant for the first time and because she had a moderate form of cerebral palsy. We'll call her Grace. My wife's high-risk status was most serious during the period leading up to full term, but Grace's high-risk concerns were centered on a possible danger to both child and mother during the labor and delivery process. This was due to the potential for spasms and other complications connected to her cerebral palsy. Now, during the hours leading up to the delivery, the two girls bonded in a way that, frankly, only mothers with children at risk might understand. In our case, everything went well, and we are still blessed to have delivered a beautiful daughter. Grace had some challenges, however, during her delivery, including a temporary stoppage of her breathing. But thankfully, she too delivered a beautiful baby girl, very healthy. However, because of her delivery complications, Grace was moved to another section of the hospital, and before she and my wife could exchange proper contact information, they were discharged from the hospital separately and abruptly. And as a consequence, they lost touch. Now, I know it's difficult to imagine this, but this was definitely in the pre-smartphone and pre-Facebook era. Almost 4 years later, we had just moved into a new home in a new subdivision, and one summer day, I was in the front garage straightening out some stuff. Like I said, it was a new subdivision, and consequently, our street had very little vehicle traffic. But as my back was turned to the street, I heard the metallic sound of a bicycle falling to the pavement, accompanied by sounds of alarm from an adult and crying from a child. I immediately turned to look, and right in front of my house was a small tandem bicycle, equipped with training wheels, oddly enough, laying on its side in the road. Beside the bike was a woman and a little girl, both dirty and scraped, picking themselves up from the road. Ran out to them right away to see if I could help, and as the woman turned to acknowledge me, her eyes grew wide when she saw me. She said, "Fred, is that you?" Well, it was Grace and her 4-year-old daughter. Our families never lost touch again after that. The second personal story is a little more recent. Some of you may know that I'm working on an album of original songs. Well, the whole wonderful process started this past spring, and we got the opportunity to record our rhythm tracks at an incredible place called OCL Studios near Chestermere. It's a fabulous studio, but it's on a rural acreage which is only accessible from a secondary gravel road. On the first morning of our recording week, I was a little uncertain as to whether I was, in fact, on the right gravel road. So I stopped for just a few seconds to quickly glance at my Google Maps printout. Then, convinced I was, in fact, on the right gravel road, I continued my drive. But 1 minute later, just as I was reaching an uncontrolled crossroads, partially shielded on the right and the left by a fence and some farm buildings, another vehicle suddenly rocketed out from the road to my right, missing the front end of my vehicle by just a few feet. Out of habit, I remember slowing down a little as I approached the crossroads, but it was clear from his speed that this other driver did not even see me. As the other vehicles sped off into the distance, I sat at the crossroads for a few moments, really shaken, and not a little amazed. I thought about those few seconds that I had paused just to look at my Google map. Seemingly random few seconds that probably saved me from a serious accident. So, my first questions of the evening are these. Have you ever had something like this happen to you? And if so, have you ever wondered why? Have you ever had anyone say to you that things happen for a reason? And if so, what was your first response? Now, if some of you answered yes to the first question, that similar things have happened to you, no one would be very surprised. If you all search your personal databases, you'll likely remember a few of these incidents. Sometimes these incidents are convenient, like when a parking spot opens up just when you drive up to it. Some are comforting, like when you were thinking of a friend or a loved one and moments later they called you or sent you a text. Some are a little more challenging, like when you left a fancy restaurant after an expensive meal and then encountered a hungry, homeless man digging through a dumpster. That actually happened to me. These strange and random combinations of events always seem to occur with a minimum level of expectation and virtually no concept of connectedness. We don't or can't intentionally cause these random combinations of events to occur, but when it does occur, the outcome will often leave us with a decision as to whether or not the combination of events is truly random. For many of us, even most of us, another combination of healthy skepticism and perhaps not so healthy fear of criticism often influence us to reach a safe decision point, a kind of one-size-fits-all category for these intriguing and not so infrequent events. So we end up calling these events coincidence. Well, what is coincidence? Coincidence is a remarkable or unique concurrence of events without apparent causal connection. A remarkable concurrence of events with no apparent cause. And we call it coincidence because it is kind of remarkable, isn't it? We call it coincidence because we can't see an apparent cause. We call it coincidence so as not to invent a cause. And perhaps we call it coincidence because it's just safer not to ask why. We can't be blamed for wanting to be on the safe side of this question of coincidence. In the modern tech age, we live in a spectrum, and we're constantly grappling with that spectrum of ideas that runs from completely crazy at one end to completely proven in the middle to completely possible at the other end. Many coincidences affect us deeply enough so that we actually flirt with the notion of a connection that we can't prove. At the same time, the longer we stay in this flirtation without any proof, the greater the possibility that people will see us lurking near the crazy zone. So, classifying these unique events as coincidence keeps us safely suspended, uncommitted, and unembarrassed, somewhere between completely crazy and completely possible. With coincidence as our default setting, we avoid the no-win proposition of either providing proof of connection or wearing the crazy pants. This safe suspension of our personal experiences is like the sociological equivalent of political correctness. And actually, like actual political correctness, it's really difficult to leave the safe zone. We have to have a reason to leave. So, if the question of coincidence is suspended in this safe zone between completely crazy and completely proven, how do we navigate the spectrum of ideas to accommodate our curiosity? How do we explore a possibly crazy something that may turn out to be completely possible? Well, an exploration like this can only happen if we are, in fact, curious. Oh, and we must be willing to change the question as well. How would the question have to change? Well, the question of coincidence would have to change to the question of synchronicity. What is synchronicity? Well, synchronicity is a remarkable or unique concurrence of events that are not connected by cause, but may be connected by meaning. I'll just read that again. It's a remarkable or unique concurrence of events that are not connected by cause, but may be connected by meaning. Another way of understanding synchronicity is to shift your focus from the components of what has happened, the cause, to the outcome of what has happened, the meaning. Remember I asked you earlier what your first response is when someone says that things happen for a reason, basically suggesting synchronicity to you. Do you politely deflect the suggestion and just move on? Do you just cynically roll your eyes and move on as well? Or do you stop and consider that the question of synchronicity becomes more provocative as the meaning of any coincidental event becomes more profound. Think about being served a delicious dessert where the ingredients are complex and possibly even secret. Is it a challenge for you to avoid obsessing with the ingredients and simply enjoy the cake? The idea of coincidence helps us rationalize our need to know the ingredients. The idea of synchronicity helps us rationalize that not knowing the ingredients doesn't change the fact that the cake is delicious. Now, before I go any further, I have a confession. The confession is that this question of synchronicity became a much larger question than I imagined when I started my research and writing. I actually started it 2 weeks ago. In fact, my exploration of the question of synchronicity became itself an actual story of possible synchronicities, connecting backward to our very first gathering in September. I have to confess that what started out as a pretty big idea anyway became a much bigger idea, which I will not be able to share in a single presentation. So, without further fanfare, allow me to begin Synchronicity Part 1. This is Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. The concept of synchronicity was created by the father of analytical psychology, Carl Gustav Jung. Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, who is the father of psychoanalysis, which is a different thing, are universally considered the two fathers of modern psychiatry and clinical psychology. The question of synchronicity begins with them. Sigmund Freud, born in Austria, and the older of the two by 20 years, was the defining voice of clinical psychology and psychiatry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As I said before, Freud is considered the father of psychoanalysis, and perhaps the fastest way to validate his impact on our contemporary lives is to name, but out of necessity not describe, some of the key concepts he created that still shape our modern practices. You'll be familiar with most of them, I'm sure. These are the main Freudian concepts: free association, transference, repression, fixation, the Oedipus complex, the libido, Freud's basic structure of the conscious and unconscious, the id, the ego, and the superego, defense mechanism, pleasure principle, penis envy. You're all familiar with those terms, I'm sure. In 1886, while studying in Paris and experimenting with the clinical application of hypnosis, Freud developed his groundbreaking clinical method of free association therapy. I couldn't resist showing a picture of his iconic treatment couch. That's where the whole thing of the couch came from. Free association encouraged patients to openly express any ideas, emotions, images, or memories that flowed from their conscious experience, or perhaps as were retrieved from their unconscious experience via dreams or hypnosis. Through free association, Freud's patients shared seemingly disconnected aspects of their psychic life, and he in turn would attempt to organize these accumulated disconnections into a possible coherent explanation for their struggle. Through what became known as the talking cure, Freud's patients experienced more significant improvements in their neuroses than had ever been seen ever before with previous treatment methods. By 1900, Freud's unique approach to psychotherapy provided the research base for a revolutionary new paradigm of the human psyche. From 1900 to 1920, Freudian psychoanalysis, as it was now called, exerted a worldwide influence on the entire field of psychiatry and psychology. Numerous international societies were formed dedicated to his teachings on psychoanalysis, and many prestigious universities and medical schools taught his theories and practices. Freud's worldwide revolution also created a chair of disciples. One of those disciples was Carl Jung. Carl Jung was a Swiss-born psychiatrist and psychotherapist who was both inspired and deeply influenced by Sigmund Freud. From 1907 to 1913, Jung and Freud carried on an intense collaborative relationship and friendship that resulted in Jung becoming the world's most prominent supporters of Freud's psychoanalytic model. I kind of laughed when I found this. This slide is basically a buddy montage of Jung and Freud. Here are the buddies on a double date. They were on a fishing trip together, did that a lot. Here it is shooting some pool on a speaking tour of the US, really like their hats. And yes, even doing shots at a party. Their scientific relationship and personal friendship was so strong that Freud referred to Jung as his adopted eldest son, his crown prince and successor. That's how close they were. But in 1912, Jung's separate research into the human psyche inspired him to write a new book called The Psychology of the Unconscious. It was his first revisioning of the Freudian psychoanalytic model. He would eventually create a different name for this revision model, analytical psychology. The emergence of this new model started a profound conflict between Jung and his famous friend and mentor. Ironically, the conflict and the eventual split, though tragic, didn't diminish either man's stature, but strangely intensified their work in an exponential way. Jung's analytical psychology and Freud's psychoanalysis continue to be the two dual lenses through which modern psychotherapy is viewed. As with Sigmund Freud, Jung contributed his own set of iconic concepts to our modern psychological lexicon, which I again will name, but not describe in detail, at least not yet. These are the main Jungian concepts that you're probably familiar with: the collective unconscious, archetypes, introversion and extroversion, complexes, persona, anima and animus, and individuation. So, what does this very short, very superficial history of psychology have to do with the question of synchronicity and the possible alternative to the question of coincidence? Well, I'm about to tell all of you, with a necessary pre-apology to the psychologists in the room. There is at least one here, for the hyper-simplified way that I will have to tell it. Freud's theory of the human psyche and the psychoanalytic method are rooted in his concepts of repression in our unconscious mind and expression in our conscious mind. His model of the interaction between the conscious and the unconscious was based on the notion that much of our conscious behavior is driven by repressed memories and ideas emanating from the deep well of our unconscious. Now, you may recall from the brief history I just covered that early in his career, Freud experimented with clinical hypnosis. Hypnosis therapy provided him with important early evidence of the unconscious repression to conscious expression pathway to various types of neuroses. His free association method, or talking cure, soon proved to be even more effective than hypnosis as a window into the patient's unconscious. This was because free association allowed the patient to be an awake, active participant in the processing of experiences, memories, and in particular, dreams. What became known as dream work was enormously important to Freud, as he believed dreams were the purest expression of the unconscious mind speaking out to the conscious world of the patient. Freud's visionary concept of the active and influential unconscious, both in the waking and the dream state, inspired Carl Jung to fully embrace the Freudian model in his early clinical practice. Ironically, it was this enthusiastic embrace that ultimately became the wedge that drove Jung and Freud apart. It was also, coincidentally, the birth story of synchronicity. How's that for a paradox? When Freud was asked to explain his theory of the conscious and unconscious to people like you and me, he often compared the human psyche to an iceberg floating in the ocean. This famous metaphor effectively illustrated that our conscious thoughts and behaviors were merely the visible outcropping of the submerged portion of the iceberg, our unconscious. The unconscious was depicted as the deeper and largely unknown dimension of ideas and memories stemming all the way back to the earliest stages of our childhood. In the Freudian iceberg, the action of dreams was regarded as an unconscious fulfillment of the deep inner wishes of the psyche. It's a testament to the power of this metaphor that even today, over 100 years later, the idea that we dream what we wish for still resonates with ordinary folks as being fundamentally true. The iceberg metaphor resonated in an extraordinary way with Carl Jung as well. First as an inspiration to conform, then as an inspiration to disrupt. Now, his story of disruption is both true and quite extraordinary. In 1909, while he was still closely associated with Freud, Jung began a series of informal dinner conversations in Zurich with a new friend, Albert Einstein. At the time, Einstein was a professor of theoretical physics at the local university and was already deeply involved in his own disruptive journey, the creation of the theory of relativity. Einstein had introduced his initial ideas about the relationship between space, time, and gravity around 1905, but didn't complete his general theory of relativity until 1915. So between 1909 and 1913, right in the heart of Einstein's unraveling of the universe, he and Carl Jung regularly met over dinner to discuss their individual studies and share their thoughts. Unfortunately, none of these conversations were ever recorded in detail. What a shame. But later on in his career, Jung himself commented on the profound significance of these dinner conversations with Einstein. These are Jung's own words. Professor Einstein was my guest on several occasions at dinner. These were the very early days when Einstein was developing his first theory of relativity, and it was he who first started me thinking about a possible relativity of time as well as space and their psychic conditionality. His genius as a thinker exerted a lasting influence on my own intellectual work. I pumped him about his relativity theory. I'm not gifted in mathematics, and I went 14 feet deep into the floor and felt quite small. More than 30 years later, the stimulus led to my relationship with the quantum physicist Wolfgang Pauli and to my thesis of psychic synchronicity. Now, we won't talk about Wolfgang Pauli or quantum physics right now, but we will in Synchronicity Part 2. For now, it's just important to know that this remarkable dialogue with Einstein prompted Carl Jung to see parallels between the new relativity model of space and time and his own evolving model of the human psyche. And does it not also raise some intriguing questions about how Jung may have in turn influenced Albert Einstein as he completed the general theory of relativity? Oh, to be a fly in the soup at one of their dinners. Now, the final thing I'm going to share with you tonight is about Jung's disruptive model of the human psyche. Just as Einstein stood on the shoulders of Newton to expand our understanding of the universe, Carl Jung stood on the iceberg of Freud to expand our understanding of ourselves. The incredible 4-year dialogue of Einstein and Jung speaks to a mutual interest in the possible links between new physics and new psychology. Einstein and Jung were both moving on that spectrum of ideas that I spoke of earlier. They were moving away from the proven towards the possible. Now, I mentioned earlier that Freud's iceberg model of the conscious and unconscious was partially validated by his extensive work with dreams. I also said that Freud believed dreams were generated by repressed memories, traumas, and wishes from deep inside the individual unconscious. Another way to frame this would be that Freud viewed the action of the unconscious as essentially self-contained and self-generating from within the bounds of our personal psychic iceberg. But as Freud's clinical practice grew, he was sometimes frustrated by accounts of dreams and images, often with ancient or even mythic themes, whose practical connection to the patient could not be easily identified. Freud rationalized that these puzzling, unconnectable dreams were not actually contradictions to his model of the self-contained unconscious. Instead, he theorized that some aspects of the personal unconscious were so severely repressed that even extensive psychoanalysis of these random mythic images might never yield a proper conscious explanation. Now, even though Jung was a long-standing follower and friend, he couldn't bring himself to accept either Freud's rationalizations or the inadequacy of Freud's psychic model. Jung concluded that Freud's view of the unconscious had to be incomplete, and that the key to its completion was embedded somewhere in those contradictions, those mysterious mythic dreams. Both Freud and Jung were themselves intense and vivid dreamers who regularly recorded their dream experiences. But it's yet another irony that the shared obsession with dreams would ultimately set them apart from one another. Freud's dream experiences led him to look inward. Jung's dream experiences led him to look outward. Carl Jung's historic breakup with Freud over these important questions prompted him to go into a kind of depression, a self-examination exile of sorts. For 3 years, he lived a superhero-like existence. By day, he would go about his normal clinical work, but by night, he would alternately meditate and sleep, experiencing regular self-induced visions that he called active imaginations. On many of these nights, he would experience repeated, intense explosions in both his waking and sleeping meditative states. He called this monumental 3-year vision quest his confrontation with the unconscious. Between 1913 and 1916, Jung faithfully recorded his active imaginations, complete with detailed illustrations, in a series of journals that would eventually become one of the most powerful esoteric works of the 20th century, the Red Book. Now, even though the contents of this journal would cast a profound light on the evolution of Jungian psychology, it's important to know that the journal itself was kept secret in his private office for his entire lifetime. On rare occasions, it's said that Jung did allow a handful of intimate friends who were sworn to secrecy to take brief looks at his journal, but he never allowed anyone to actually study it. Even after his death in 1961, the Red Book remained a virtual secret until 2009, when his family finally agreed to its general publication. So this book was only published in 2009. Now, the Red Book is an unbelievable treasure. It's full of unique visions, dreams, images, and detailed notes that we now know inspired 2 foundational concepts of analytical psychology: the concept of the archetype and the concept of the collective unconscious. Jung's concept of archetypes grew out of his observations of repeating patterns of thought, theme, and form that reoccurred time and time again across countries, continents, cultures, and most importantly, across history. These repeating patterns were widely manifested in art, architecture, and cultural imagery. Jung identified and then articulated the deeper ancient origins of many of these repeating patterns. He called these original patterns archetypes. It needs to be mentioned here that Carl Jung was truly a lifelong seeker of knowledge. In addition to his medical and psychiatric training, Jung was well read in other diverse disciplines such as Eastern philosophy, anthropology, history, and theology. This broad-based knowledge led him to the theory that archetypes were actually inherited ancient forms, selectively inhabiting the unconscious mind of our entire species. And this was apparently without regard for space or time. His own confrontations with the unconscious, recorded in the Red Book, led him to conclude that he personally had seen visions and dreamt dreams that were timeless psychic forms, shared with both our ancient ancestors and our future descendants. Archetypes themselves can operate in different ways. For example, basic archetypal narratives like creation or redemption or even the quest for truth, or archetypal forms like circles or pyramids, are evident worldwide and active throughout the entire history of man. But as a foundation for the conscious expression of human identity, it is archetypal figures that we are most familiar with. This is a list of basic archetypal figures that have grown out of Jung's paradigm. Just take a moment and have a look at this. I want you to think about your own life in the context of these archetypes. Can you recall your earliest childhood recollection of any of these archetypes? Is there any way to explain why some or even one of these archetypes resonates with you more than the others? Can you recognize the various ways that you might act out your personal archetypes and actually become them in your conscious world? Carl Jung would have been adamant that these questions could be asked of any person at any time, past, present, or future. Now, the final part of Synchronicity Part 1 begins with two of the key questions that Jung grappled with on his way to the theory of synchronicity. Where and how do archetypes exist in space and time? And how do archetypes enter our unconscious as companions to our normal human instincts and actual memories? His answers are something for us to grapple with. Now, Jung's decisive split with Sigmund Freud in 1913 was preceded and followed by two defining experiences that bear repeating. The experience that preceded the split was his 4-year dinner dialogue with Albert Einstein, which exposed him to the new physics of space and time. The experience that followed the split was his 3-year visionary Red Book period, where he encountered the ancient realm of the archetype, independently operating across space and time. Now, these incredible interrelated experiences pointed Jung toward the possible existence of an important third component of the human psyche. It's an ancient dimension that precedes and informs our unconscious. It's a dimension of archetypes and ancient memories that are shared by our entire species. It's a dimension much deeper and more expansive than our personal unconscious. He called it the collective unconscious. Now, the collective unconscious was a representation of what Jung called the psychic life of our ancestors. He saw the collective unconscious as flowing from wherever and whenever the beginning was, surrounding and informing us in our current existence, but also continually renewing and ready for those not yet born. To illustrate this new dimension, Jung modified the Freudian iceberg metaphor to include the presence of the collective unconscious. Not surprisingly, the new metaphor includes the ocean, the vast unbounded medium that is the liquid form of the very same elements that created the iceberg. I also found myself thinking that Jung's iceberg could be an interesting, perhaps unintended metaphor for the question of synchronicity itself. Ask yourself, which is more important? For us to dissect and completely prove the individual elements of Jung's metaphor? Or is it more important for us to just simply reflect on the elegant notion that it is all water? So, if you've managed to stay awake and have listened closely through this very necessary part 1, my hope is that you'll both think about and anticipate part 2 with the following 3 questions in mind. How open are you to the idea that coincidental events really do happen for a deeper reason? Does the historic connection, which maybe some of you knew but maybe some of you didn't, between Einstein and Jung, physics and psychology, inspire a new way of thinking about coincidence and synchronicity? Can you think of a personal story of coincidence that you might now question in a new way? In order to capitalize on the recent mega opening of Star Wars Episode 7, which, by the way, is considered a classic illustration of Jungian archetypes. I'm not kidding. Just Google that. We will be boldly expanding our own marketing efforts. So in concert with the Sunday, January 17th, 2016 release of Synchronicity Part 2, we will be launching our very own line of Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, and Albert Einstein action figures. Did you even know these existed? This was crazy, right? Now, there is no question that these are must-have gifts for hardcore fans of the completely possible. Okay, thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening.